Thank you very much, and thank you for Hastings Palestine Solidarity Campaign for organizing this. Thank you all for attending. I am going to talk about Palestinian general elections in relation to the nature of Oslo Agreement and facts on the ground. Electing a Palestinian Legislative Council is part of Oslo Agreement, and the nature of this agreement will help us understand the meaning of democracy under occupation. Oslo agreements, as many of you must know, came as a result of secret negotiations at Oslo between PLO and Israel. It is an these agreements are interim. The agreement of 1995 created the Palestinian Authority, dependent on international funding. It also created an elite class with a VIP system. This elite class is not interested in challenging the status quo, and therefore it is detached from Palestinian people. The agreement also divided the West Bank into 3 areas under different jurisdictions. It disconnected Gaza from the West Bank. Jerusalem, by the way, was closed just before signing the agreement and became subject to a permit system that Israel tightened throughout the years. The agreement outlined specific legislative responsibilities for Palestinians that, and this is very important, that could not contradict the accord. It gave, Israel gave the Palestinian Legislative Council limited power in certain spheres. So Israel controls, overall control, especially security, is under Israel. This and the fragmentation of the land enabled Israel to control even the quorum of the Palestinian Legislative Council. For example, by and this happened, not allowing members of the council from Gaza to attend sessions in Ramallah or in the West Bank, or arresting members of parliament. Although the agreement postponed Jerusalem to a later stage, among other issues such as Palestinian refugees and Israeli settlements, it was included in the electoral process, in the agreement itself. But I am going to quote what the Israeli chief negotiator, Uri Savir, and how he explained the inclusion of Jerusalem in the process. And I start the quote. Each Palestinian candidate living in Jerusalem would be required to have a second binding address outside the city, making it possible for Israel to claim that no Palestinian Jerusalemite was standing for the elections, end of quote. And then, of course, this will help you understand how Israel considers Jerusalem unified as the capital of Israel, and why, which I'm sure Ramzy will talk about, the issue of Jerusalem in the current elections. But this is the background of the issue of Jerusalem. And by the way, in the presidential election of 2005 and 2006, for example, Israel only allowed, and when it came under this one, it was pressured from the international community at the beginning, did not want to include Jerusalem in the second elections of the Palestinian Legislative Council, but allowed only a few thousands of Palestinians from Jerusalem to vote in station polls next to them. The rest, they had to cross checkpoints and even try and go through the, try and what can we say, cross the wall that was built in 2002. So it has never been a straightforward approval from Israel to include Jerusalem into the elections. Now, the first elections that took place in 1996, when Fatah Party won the elections, and this was during the interim period as Palestinians were supposed to be transitioned to a statehood. Now, during that period and after the elections, the question remains, how is democracy going to be practiced under the occupation? Because democracy, as we all know, is about separation of power. And it is about rule of law, respect of human rights, which is beautiful and great. But how are Palestinians going to implement these elements if most of Oslo Agreement is focused on fighting terrorism as defined by Israel, and it is about committing the Palestinian Authority to security coordination? And by the way, this happened. For example, the Palestinian Authority arrested activists from Birzeit University in 1996. And when the Court of Justice, High Court of Justice, Palestinian, I mean, called this arrest as illegal because it was without warrant and that they should be released immediately, not only the Palestinian Authority ignored the decision, but also asked the Chief Justice to resign. So it is this dilemma that they have to be committed to security coordination and to fighting terrorism, and at the same time, how could they prevail? How could rule of law prevail? So this explains why the executive branch or executive agency has this power and ignores this ABC democracy framework, which is separation of power. All Palestinian Palestinian Council legislatives resolution to ensure judicial independence are failed until today. So this is the situation. Now the second general elections happened in 2006. Between the first and the second, there was a dramatic change. First of all, peace process failed, especially at Camp David in 2000. Palestinian authorities' corruption made people fed up with the ruling party, with Fatah. Israel continued with its colonial project, building more and more settlements. This led to the Second Intifada. Now, the Second Intifada was militarized. It wasn't like the First Intifada, non-violent. This enabled Israel, coupled with the 9/11, to employ repressive measures against Palestinians with impunity, with never being held accountable because it was fighting terrorism as it defined. So Israel was able to demonize not only Hamas, but the Palestinian resistance itself under the pretext of fighting terrorism. Now, also during that period, Israel decided to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza, but leaving the general security in its hands. And of course, it was under the blockade, by the way, started when this unilateral decision was taken and implemented. There was, after the elections, as Hamas won the elections, Israel and the international community rejected the results. Even, I would say, even Fatah, because, you know, now they have, if the international community, because Palestinian Authority is dependent on international funding, and international funding would be conditional to Palestinian Authority. There was internal fighting, as you all know, between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas took over Gaza. This led the international community to impose sanctions and refused to deal with the new government. So Gaza was suffocated by this neoliberal order. Israel waged 3 wars, as you all know, against Gaza. Now, international donors came with a reform agenda. It is important to know that this reform agenda focused mainly on enhancing Palestinian Authority's counter-terrorism capabilities. That's mostly. So 40%, about 30 to 40, I'm not sure whether it's, I think it's 40 now, 40% of Palestinian authorities' budget is allocated to security forces. And international community, even Trump administration, exempted security forces from any fund cuts that it imposed on the Palestinian Authority in the previous administration. Yes, that's the focus. The next elections due was in 2014, never happened. It was suspended because of the division, because of the international community rejection of the results of the elections. Now, some people say, I've read a few reviews and few articles, and I'm gonna end soon, that, you know, it is almost impossible to hold elections under occupation. I must tell you that there is no time to talk about this, but I myself practiced democracy under occupation, pre-Oslo period. We elected, we had elections. I elected my student council at Birzeit University, for example. Trade unions. There was, the Palestinian political system was democratic. The problem now, PLO is marginalized, which represents all Palestinians around the world, that Samah is going to talk about in a minute. So the democratic system pre-Oslo and democracy pre-Oslo was by political parties who had unified national plan about ending the occupation, how to end the occupation, about the crucial issues that Oslo postponed to a later stage. For example, the issue of refugees, Jerusalem, Israeli settlements, they had a clear vision about it. So they were able to mobilize Palestinians, and this is what happened in the first Intifada. So the problem is mainly, I would say, of course, Israel would prevent and would impede, and Israel does not want Palestinians practicing democracy, as I've just shown, but also the internal problems. Palestinians, they have to reform their political system, unify their national plan to be able to challenge Israel's repressive measures and be able to practice democracy even under occupation. Thank you very much, and I will answer questions later.